Thank you, Secretary of Justice, for inviting me to take part in this forum. Such a small contribution as I can make to your deliberations come from long years in the law, in the course of which I've learned at least one thing: honor the wisdom of the common man, for therein lies the essence of the common law. And a subsidiary lesson perhaps is this, that history casts a long shadow. Now, in 1815, China, under the rule of the Emperor Jia, was at peace. But Britain, in the course of acquiring a great empire, was at war, and it had been so continuously for 20 more odd years. Now, when, after the Battle of Waterloo in June 1815, the Duke of Wellington, the commander of British forces, was asked how he saw the outcome, his laconic reply was, "It was a close-run thing." Now, his foot soldiers, formed in squares, withstood the repeated onslaught of Napoleon's fearsome cavalry. Not a single square broke rank. Discipline ultimately prevailed. Now, transposing the scene from the heights of Waterloo in June 1815 to the streets of Hong Kong in November, December 2019, what do we see? The police force in serried ranks, protecting property, safeguarding lives, staying calm and restrained, withstanding onslaughts by assailants, wearing protective gear, weapons-grade gas masks, wielding sharpened iron rods, throwing petrol bombs. And they did this month after month. Now, I put myself in the place of the ordinary policeman. He had been doing this for more than 6 months. His name has been posted on social media. Doxing involved not only himself, but also his children. They are bullied at school. The quarters where he lived have been firebombed. His wife is seriously frightened, and his mother-in-law says to him repeatedly, "Why do you protect other people's property and not your own home, your own family?" She might even have added, when ordered to make an arrest, he's required to exercise reasonable force, whatever that means. Now, the thug he's arresting knows no reason, no restraint. An arrest risks serious injury to himself, and some of his colleagues had been injured and hospitalized. The thug carries no ID card. He will not disclose his name, will not cooperate in having his photo or his fingerprint taken. He will not accept police bail. He cannot be charged. So, after 48 hours, according to law, he has to be released unconditionally to repeat the same outrage the next weekend. Now, how close was Hong Kong then to total collapse? Now, this we ordinary citizens will never know. This is something the government, for obvious reasons, will never disclose. But as an observer, looking from the outside, I would say it was a close-run thing. All it took was for one police unit to break ranks, to say, "We've had enough." The whole force would have collapsed, but discipline held, and for that, the community should be forever grateful. Now, this, as I see it, is the true scenario against which the national security law should be viewed. The rest is creative fiction crafted to put the Hong Kong government in the worst possible light. What Hong Kong faced was an insurgency, the overthrow of government, nothing less. Now, the insurgents made the classic mistake of the cowardly, of the schoolyard bully. They took the government's low-key response, its restraint, as signs of weakness. So for a few months, the leaders strutted on the stage as if they owned the whole show. They attracted the label of freedom fighters and got themselves onto the cover of Time magazine. They took no responsibility for the misery they caused to millions of their fellow citizens and the billions of dollars of damage they inflicted, to be paid for by Hong Kong taxpayers. Now, what happened on Sunday, 18th August 2019, is a good example. The police had raised no objection to a mass gathering in Victoria Park, provided the organizers arranged for 200 marshals to control the crowds. But the police objected to a procession to Central and a further mass gathering there. Now, in open defiance of the law, the leaders raised a huge banner and led a procession down the highways to Central, vaunting their impunity from the law. So filled were they with their own sense of triumph that they forgot the inherent strength of the law, that the law has long arms. In retrospect, it can be seen that the seeds of insurgency were laid many years before. As Professor Cullen recently explained, much of the world had been dominated by the notion of Western ascendancy for some 200 years. China's decline in the late Qing dynasty had been accelerated by Western belligerency. But after World War II, the balance began to shift. Now, the USA, for all its awesome firepower, met stalemate in Korea, defeat in Vietnam, and expulsion in Cuba. Then came the astonishing rise of China after the end of the Cultural Revolution in the early 1980s. The tectonic plates began to shift, but there was no change in Western thinking. It clung tenaciously to the notion of Western ascendancy. One aspect of this, as Professor Cullen puts it, is, quotes, turbulent pushback from an unnerved Western media. Now, this pushback reflects the stance of Western powers clinging to its assumed ascendancy. With the breakup of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, China was seen more and more as posing a threat to the dominance of the West. How to counteract that? Destabilize Hong Kong was one answer. The thinking seems to run along these lines. China stands today as a strong, homogeneous nation state, but it wasn't that long ago that China was splintered into separate fiefdoms, dominated by warlords. Well, maybe territorial integrity could be broken up again. Now, the stirrings of industrial action in the late 1980s in a lousy little shipyard in Gdansk, Danzig in the terminology, a small port on the Baltic Sea, could lead to the eventual breakup of the Soviet Empire. Why wouldn't the seeds of insurgency sown in Hong Kong do the same thing to China's territorial integrity? The signs of such a movement are everywhere to be seen. We need to look no further than at how the controversy surrounding the national security law arose. Now, as everyone knows, the Basic Law Article 23 required the Hong Kong SAR on its own to enact laws to prohibit treason, secession, subversion, etc. Now, the laws in the statute books inherited from colonial times, scattered, in fact, over 3 ordinances, were plainly unfit for that purpose. So, 5 years after reunification, the government issued a consultation paper on proposals to implement Article 23. It made out a strong case. Now, this is what it said. Quotes, all countries around the world have expressed provisions on their statute books to prevent and punish crimes which endanger the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and security of the state. Therefore, while nationals of a state enjoy the privilege of protection provided by it, on the one hand, the individual citizens have a reciprocal obligation to protect the state by not committing criminal acts which threaten the existence of the state, and to support legislation which prohibits such acts, on the other hand, unquote. The proposal took into account a whole range of constitutional guarantees of personal freedom, speech, expression, the press, freedom from arbitrary arrest, sanctity of the home, etc., etc. All thinking persons would have realized that to implement Article 23 was an absolute necessity. The central government had entrusted this to the Hong Kong SAR. It was a considerable responsibility. Now, what was required was not a regional security law, it was a national security law affecting not only security within the region, but nationally. To emphasize Hong Kong's high degree of autonomy, this law was to be enacted by the SAR, quotes, on its own, unquotes. When the National Security Legislative Provision Bill was introduced in LegCo in February 2003, one would have thought that all community leaders would have given it their support. But if there were flaws in its details, these could be ironed out in committee. There was no rational basis for a total rejection of the bill. There was only one possible alternative to the enactment of the law by the local legislature, its promulgation by the central government. But misinformation got to work in the social media. People's passions were aroused. Dark forces were at play to defeat the bill, and it failed to pass. So, fast forward now to early 2019. The controversy surrounding another piece of legislation, the Return of Fugitive Offenders Amendment Bill. The international community was at that time much concerned about cross-country crimes, money laundering, and terrorist financing. Now, to align Hong Kong with other developed economies, it was necessary to upgrade the existing ordinance, hence the amending statute. A scare campaign was mounted through social media. The bill was portrayed as allowing mainland agents to grab people off the streets of Hong Kong and bring them to trial across the border. Trouble in the streets erupted, turning into the most damaging unrest Hong Kong has ever seen. This is what Mr. C.H. Tung, former chief executive, said in May 2019, quotes, as Hong Kong has failed to enact its own security legislation for over 20 years, it had become an easy target for hostile foreign opportunists to disrupt public order, using Hong Kong in effect as a proxy for a wider power conflict, unquote. On Wednesday, 12th June 2019, an organized group of rioters outside the fence perimeter, fighting to get into the Legislative Council building, forced the suspension of the second reading of the bill. Now, 3 days later, the government announced the withdrawal of the bill. The speech made by the chief executive was calculated to calm nerves and dampen passions. It was a model of restraint and humility. She said this, I want to stress that the original purposes of the exercise stem from my and my team's passion for Hong Kong and our empathy for Hong Kong people. I feel deep sorrow and regret that the deficiencies in our work and various other factors have stirred up substantial controversies and dispute in society following the relatively calm periods of the past 2 years, disappointing many people. We will adopt the most sincere and humble attitude to accept criticisms and make improvements so that we can continue to connect with the people of Hong Kong, unquote. Now that surely would have satisfied demands of the protesters. Their aim had been achieved, the withdrawal of the bill, but not at all, showing beyond doubt that the movement had much deeper and darker roots. Now, Monday, 1st of July, was a public holiday to celebrate Hong Kong's reunification with the mainland. On that day, an organized group broke into the Legislative Council building and trashed the Legislative Council chamber. The national emblem was defaced. The Hong Kong colonial flag was raised. The rioters had, in effect, declared war on the government, on the existing constitutional order. It was a war on democracy, just as it was in 1933, when Hitler's thugs burned the Reichstag, the German parliament. This was the moment for the veteran leaders of the democratic movement, the pro-Dems members of LegCo, to distance themselves from the movement, to condemn acts of violence and desecration. Not one did, thereby allying themselves inextricably with the violent segment of the movement. Fast forward again to 11th to 12th July 2020, soon after the enactment of the national security law. Various agitators had got together to mount what they called primary elections to find the best candidates for the LegCo elections due to take place later that year. They've since been arrested on suspicion of subversion under the new national security law. Now, in a report to Parliament this month, the British Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab said that the national security law was being used to, quote, stifle political opposition, unquote. It seems, sadly, that the Foreign Secretary had not been told the full facts, or is it possible that someone of that standing would knowingly distort the truth? Because most of the truth of that story is actually on public record. The so-called primaries were simply a small part of a larger plot calculated to bring down the government. This was described as, quotes, 10 steps to mutual destruction, unquotes, which had been outlined in Apple Daily in late April 2020, last year. The label attached to this plot is Lam Chao, meaning in English, we burn, you burn, an expression taken from a popular TV series. It was on its face a last desperate attempt by the insurgents to bring down the government. Now, the full facts have not been revealed. Investigations are still going on. The degree of culpability of the individuals have not been assessed. The case has yet to come on for trial. What, for instance, was put to the voters to induce them to come out and vote in the primaries? Probably different things were said to different constituents, and there may be questions as to the truthfulness of what was said. According to the police, the voters were paid substantial sums to take part in the process. Arising from this, apparently, 1.6 million Hong Kong dollars have been frozen. The significance of this will be reviewed later on at trial, presumably. Under such circumstances, how could it possibly be right for the British Foreign Secretary to assert that the national security law is being used to stifle dissent or opposition? As things stand today, there is a bill in the British Parliament entitled, quotes, Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill 2021, unquote. It is meeting with considerable opposition from ordinary citizens who have launched street protests. Now, this is what the policy paper supporting the bill says, quotes, protests are an important part of our vibrant and tolerant democracy. Under human rights law, we all have the right to gather and express our views, but these rights are not absolute rights. That fact raises important questions for the police and wider society to consider about how much disruption is tolerable and how to deal with protesters who break the law. A fair balance should be struck between individual rights and the general interests of the community, unquote. Section 59 of that bill, for instance, abolishes the common law offense of public nuisance and replaces it with a statutory offense of very wide scope, attracting 10 years imprisonment on indictment. Now, would it be right for, say, the Hong Kong Chief Secretary to comment on this provision, on how the, quotes, fair balance should be struck in the UK? Obviously not. So how is the reciprocal position justified? What is more, the national security law deals with something more fundamental than the so-called fair balance. It arms the Hong Kong government for the first time since reunification with effective legislation to deal with an insurgency. The law starts with general principles, where the lawful rights and interests of Hong Kong residents are fully protected. The common law principles governing criminal trials are safeguarded, including, for instance, the presumption of innocence, the exclusion of prejudicial evidence, etc. If one looks, for instance, at the US Patriot Act of 2001, the contrast with Hong Kong's national security law is stark. That is an act to deter and punish terrorist acts in the USA and around the world. It is extremely difficult to judge from the text of that law its overall effect, for it is not only an enabling act, but also an amending act, amending many other enactments. So unless one is familiar with those other enactments, it is simply not possible to make sense of the Patriot Act of 2001. But its introduction paragraph is startling. It says, quotes, any provision of this act as applied to any person or circumstance shall be construed so as to give it the maximum effect permitted by law, unless such holding should be one of utter invalidity or unenforceability, in which event such provision shall be deemed severable from this act, unquote. There's no mention of presumption of innocence, no safeguards for the rights of the defendant. The repeated accusations made by Western leaders and media of Beijing's so-called stifling of freedoms in Hong Kong through the use of the national security law is so far from reality that the conclusion is inevitable. As Mr. C.H. Tung said, Hong Kong is being used as a proxy for wider power conflict. Thank you.